Okay, it's for real this time. Welcome, everyone. Feel free to keep getting your coffee, getting yourself settled, but I'm going to go ahead and get going with our welcome and announcements before we move on to our first set of presentations for the day. So, thank you all so much for being here for the 8th Annual ArchivesSpace Member Forum. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace, and in addition to being joined today by all of you people, I'm joined by my fellow ArchivesSpace program team members, Lori Arp and Christine DeBella, who you saw at the registration desk, Brian Hoffman, who's in the back, and Donald Smith, who's in the front. So it's really exciting to get to see all of my team members and actually meet two of them because there's been a pandemic. This is the first time we've had this member forum since 2019. It's really exciting. I'm happy to be here. I'm energized. It's also very surreal. How many of you I've walked up to, and I've known you now for years, and I'm saying, nice to meet you, and that's a very strange feeling, but it's also, I think, a testament to this community. The new faces in this room and the longtime community members who've been here for a forum or 7 before, it shows the commitment that we have and our willingness to show up, participate, share, and learn with each other. So I think that that's really great. So thank you all for being here. And I want to give a little extra thank you to our presenters today. I'll introduce the presenters before each of their sessions, but I've included their names up here. I say it every forum, but the purpose of forums like this is to create an opportunity for users to learn from one another. We couldn't have forums like this without community members that are willing to discuss and present what they're doing and what they're learning to others. But I also know it was a lot harder this year than ever to find the time and energy to present, so again, thank you to each of the presenters here today. In addition to the wonderful presentations we're going to have, we're also going to be holding a 1-hour discussion session, which I know I've already told you about, that we'll be doing at the end of the forum. We will select 4 topics based on the suggestions provided. There are 2 pieces of paper on the back there. If you have a topic that you would like to suggest, please write it there. You can write it at any point, but you can also, we're going to have a scheduled break. You can write it during the break time. We'll pick 4 topics off that board to have discussions for the 1 hour. Discussions will be ongoing for the full hour, but every 15 minutes I'll do a time call to give you the opportunity to move from discussion to discussion if you'd like. But if a conversation is particularly great, feel free to stay as long as you'd like, or if a conversation is not for you, you're more than welcome to move on to another before the 15 minutes are up. If you are interested in the forum agenda or any of the other helpful info on the wiki, you did get an email from Eventbrite that had a link to the forum, so you can find the agenda there. Or you can go to our website, archivespace.org, and go to using ArchivesSpace, and then go to the forum section and select the schedule. And if you're looking at the schedule online, you'll notice that in addition to today, there are 2 virtual trainings that are happening next week in conjunction with SAA. One is a training on space management on August 30th, and one is a training on rights management on August 31st. There is still space to register for the rights training. I shouldn't have said the word space in that sentence. There is still room to register for rights on the 31st, so please feel free to go ahead and register for that. Unless you've already registered for the other, you can only attend one training. Now, some general housekeeping stuff. Beverages have been provided for the forum. Please make use of them. There's coffee, tea, water, that sort of thing. Beverages will be available all the way through the break, and then at 11 o'clock, they're going to take that away. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you top off your coffee before 11 o'clock. I know that I will. To minimize risk and to keep each of us safe, I do ask that you keep your mask on unless you are drinking. We are recording today's sessions. The recordings are going to be linked on the wiki in the coming days. If you need any kind of help or assistance, please reach out to me or Christine DeBella, and we'll be sure to help you out however we can. We've all got the Wi-Fi password, so I feel like we're pretty set now. And with that, we're going to go ahead and move into our first set of presentations for the day. So our first presenter is Rachel Searcy. Where's Rachel? Hey, Rachel, if you want to come up here, we'll go ahead and pull up your slides. All right. So while Rachel is getting set up, is that how you want it to look? Yeah, on there. Okay. Would you like for me to introduce you, or you feel ready to go? All right. So your first session today is going to be broad vocabulary, implementing alternate vocabularies for improved access and description. Your presenter is Rachel Searcy from New York University. New York University employs Library of Congress subject headings for its breadth of topics, but also recognizes its inherent biases, slow nature to change, and conceptual gaps for specific areas. Focused subject terms lists such as medical subject headings or Homosaurus provide opportunities to address gaps in concepts, address the damage done by harmful subject headings, and ultimately enhance the discovery of archival collections. This presentation will focus on the implementation of alternate vocabularies using ArchivesSpace, including a practical overview of system functionality, local policy considerations, an examination of the role of controlled access points alongside narrative archival description, and an affirmation that we are responsible for our metadata and its impact on our staff and users. Rachel?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So today I'd like to talk with you a little bit about some of the work we're undertaking at NYU to address harmful subject headings through the use of alternate vocabularies in ArchivesSpace. I'm going to give a bit of a practical overview of the subject record functionality and talk about our local policy decisions, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the role of controlled access points alongside narrative archival description. Okay. I asked my boss, I was like, do you think I can make this picture a metaphor for controlled vocabularies? And she was like, just sort of a nice way of saying no, but I'm still going with it. So at NYU, we employed Library of Congress subject headings, or LCSH, as a general default for access points to our collections. It's a multidisciplinary vocabulary that includes headings for a vast breadth of topics. So at its best, it gathers together variant terms to support subject-based browsing across provenance-based collections with the ultimate goal of access. But we also recognize Library of Congress's inherent biases, the institution's slow and in many cases reluctant nature to revise the vocabulary, and the conceptual gaps that exist for specific areas. There's an inherent tension between attempting to fix a concept into a single expression and the dynamic nature of language. And that's going to be a challenge for any controlled vocabulary. But there are some systemic problems at the heart of the Library of Congress and how it maintains the vocabulary, including the adherence to literary warrant, privileging the experience of dominant identities, and an eroding sense of trust with the larger cataloging community. From Sanford Berman to change the subject, biased subject headings have been a long simmering problem. So at NYU, we're looking for an approach that leverages the benefits of controlled vocabularies while empowering us to more fully exercise our professional judgment and centering equity in our descriptive decision-making. In recent years, we've made concerted efforts to re-examine our archival practices through the lens of anti-racism. We've done discrete reparative description projects, revised our processing manual in an effort to decenter whiteness and address silences, and instituted policy changes to improve transparency about the interventions we take in our collections. Authority work is yet another part of this effort as we look to re-examine how we assign controlled access points, what vocabularies we use, and our role in creating name records in the name authority file. We had a handful of known problem terms that were already on our mind, but we also figured that because of the systemic problems I mentioned earlier, we probably had more problematic terms than we realized. At that time, we had 9,328 ArchivesSpace subject terms. And these are the terms that our colleagues and users are encountering and that are potentially causing painful or uncomfortable experiences for them. So we created an Airtable base with all of our subject terms and identified 170 in this first pass that were problematic in some way, but there are likely more to address. This can happen in waves or as collections come up in the course of accessioning or processing. We're trying to do what we can, when we can, and always be open to doing more. We observed some clustering of problematic terms around a few topics. They are crime, gender and sexuality, housing and poverty, immigration, which I realize I forgot to put on here, indigeneity, race and ethnicity, and default identities. We also identified 3 tracks to address these issues. There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Some terms have a clear and obvious replacement in an alternate vocabulary. Others will require additional research and/or collaboration with our colleagues. And that could be because there isn't a great term available for us in another vocabulary, Or it could be that we need to learn more about the specific collection it's applied to and determine if it's maybe a term that's appropriate for one collection but not another. We also have some terms that will be best addressed through local practice rather than using different vocabularies. So we started with that first category, the one-to-one replacements, because it's the most straightforward. So enter alternate vocabularies. I'm going to talk about just a few today, but there are hundreds supported by MARC, and it really depends on the needs of your collections and users. I'm going to talk about Mesh and Homosaurus. We chose them because we felt like they could help us with some of our known issues. Medical subject headings, or Mesh, is maintained by the National Library of Medicine and is used for biomedical and health-related resources. It's well established, in high use, albeit for specialized resources, and regularly maintained. While we don't use most of the terms in this vocabulary, we don't have a need for terms about specific diseases or medications. We have found that the category for groups of people is not perfect, but reliably a bit more progressive than LCSH. Homosaurus is a linked data vocabulary of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer terms that supports improved access to LGBTQ+ resources, provides alternatives to harmful subject headings and other vocabularies, and addresses conceptual gaps concerning gender and sexuality in those broader vocabularies. It's currently maintained by the Digital Transgender Archives. We have a number of collections documenting LGBTQ+ art and activism, and have long been dissatisfied with many of the terms applied to these collections, or the absence of particular topics that we wanted to highlight that were just not available in LCSH. So how does one implement another vocabulary exactly? There are two parts, the functional implementation and then local usage. The first is simple and something that you can do in the staff interface if you have the right permissions. So to do that, you go to System, Manage Controlled Value List, and then select the list that you want. So let's see. So here we want the subject source list. This is actually one of my favorite tips for leveling up in ArchivesSpace. Most of the times when you see a drop-down list, that's something you can usually modify. So here we see some of our sources for subject headings. Mesh is actually already in there as a default, but let's say that we wanted to add Homosaurus. So I'm gonna click on that Create Value button, and then I wanna put the source code for the vocabulary as assigned by Library of Congress. So this identifies the vocabulary in a machine-readable way. So let's see, where am I? So now the new term is in the system, but it doesn't look quite right on the top. And we want it to look like, oh, the slide's cut off. There we go. We want it to look like that on the bottom. So to do that, if you are locally hosted, you'll want to go in the file with all of those values and translations. Looks like this. But if you're, and then actually, sorry. So that's what that file sort of looks like. It has the value and then the translation for what you're going to see in the staff interface. If you're using a service provider, I imagine you can just ask them to update that for you. So that's the system functionality side. The more complicated part is how you use an alternate vocabulary. And here's where I will tell you that I am not a cataloger. When we were implementing Mesh and Homosaurus, we needed to learn how these vocabularies operate, what their organizing principles are, and what rules govern their usage. So for example, can you use subdivisions? If so, which ones and in which order? Mesh in particular has really helpful documentation on their site. But of course there are rules and then there's local application of them. There's still individual judgment as well as the unique needs of individual collections. So let's look at the subject record as a record type in ArchivesSpace and see where some of these decisions show up. So the fields with the red stars are required, so we need those. But right away, we see that we have some other options available to us. Do we want to use the authority ID field or not? What about the scope note? It's worth thinking about if and how you might want to use these fields. And we'll use them differently for one vocabulary versus another. We decided to make the authority ID field optional for all subject records, regardless of which vocabulary they come from. But if we do use them, it needs to be specifically formatted. Otherwise, we get validation errors in connection. Excuse me. Sorry, it's not COVID. The scope field is interesting. It's not something that we typically use when working with subject records. But we did decide to use it when we use an alternate vocabulary to replace or avoid a specific term from LCSH. So in these circumstances, we write something to the effect of like, this term is intentionally used as an alternative to, and then the LC term. So we do that for a few reasons. One is that if an ArchivesSpace user is searching for that harmful string, this alternative will show up for them in the staff interface. Another reason, is for transparency in our decision making. We have a lot of legacy data from a time when folks did not have much training on subject records or subject headings. And so we know that we still have a lot of incorrect, obsolete, or see also references instead of authorized headings. And so we wanted to leave enough of a trail of decision making here so that if someone comes across this heading, they'll understand that it was created and applied with intention. So once you make these decisions, you want to document them for yourself to help with consistency. Sorry, I have something in my throat. So I'll also note here that at NYU, we do not use the public user interface. We export our EAD and MARC records in order to publish finding aids and catalog records. Thank you. This subject scope note does not export into either of those files, but if you are using the PUI, please note that this subject scope note is publicly viewable. So that's just something to factor into when making these local decisions. So with all that in mind, I just want to talk about one collection to show some of these ideas in practice. We have the records of Gapimne, a volunteer-led community organization for queer and trans people of Asian Pacific Islander descent in the New York area. We first received their records in 2015, and at that point, the group's name was an acronym that stood for Gay Asian Pacific Islander Men of New York. Over time, the group has changed, both in name. Gapimne is now no longer an acronym, and now really works to center queer and trans folks. So when we received an accretion in 2021, we needed to make some changes to the descriptive front matter to reflect that shift, but it also gave us an opportunity to revisit the subject terms. The organization changed its name for a reason, and we wanted to represent their work through our descriptive records as faithfully and respectfully as possible. We asked if they were interested in talking with us about this, and they said yes, but that they were also busy. So sometimes, often in fact, this collaboration can take time. We had two main questions. Of the subject records previously applied to the collections, which ones did they want to keep, if any? So they marked those up for us. We said we'd also like to add terms related to activism, community, and discrimination, but for that, each of these, we had a choice to make. We could use a very specific term, like queer activism, or we could use a broader term, like LGBTQ+ activism. And so we made it clear to them that we were happy to do either, but that if possible, we'd like to be consistent. And they told us that those larger, broader umbrella terms made more sense to them. We had an additional wrinkle. So a few of the original LCSH applied to the collection described groups of people in pejorative ways. Why describe people by what they are not, rather than who they are? At that point in time, Homosaurus had a term for Asian American LGBTQ+ people, but not one for Pacific Islander American LGBTQ+ people. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that. I couldn't find much information on how new terms get added. So I sent them an email basically saying what I've already said here. And I didn't know what to expect. I had just been through a long, confusing, and ultimately unsuccessful LCSH change proposal for something else. So it was such a change of pace when I got an email back quite quickly that was basically like, that's a great idea, we'll add it, anything else you want? So very quickly, this new term was available in the vocabulary. We applied it to the collection, and it was really great to come back to the donor to say, like, we've made some revisions thanks to your input. And also there's this new term that is not only available for your collection, but that other libraries can use. Okay, I'm getting to the end. So this collection is an encapsulation of a lot of things. It's an application of different vocabularies, of iterative description, how accessioning affords opportunities to return to collections and revisit our description of them, and collaboration between archivists and donors. It's also a great example of the complementary nature of narrative description and controlled vocabularies. So if you remember, this organization changed its name to focus on queer and trans people, but the donor recommended that we use broad subject terms like LGBTQ+. And so while those controlled access points are broad, in the scope note, in the historical note, we can add more nuance to really highlight that focus and provide that shading. I think it's also a great example of how much power and choice we actually have. So if we don't like the options in one vocabulary, we can use another. We can do something different with subject terms than we do with free text description. We make these decisions based on what we know about the collection, the creators, the record subjects, and our users. And while I don't expect to be successful every time I ask for a new term, it's also worth remembering that sometimes I will be. Okay, so we've done some good work so far, and there's still a lot we can do. Of those original 9,328 terms, we identified 170 we had issues with, and we've already addressed 51 of those. Here are just a few of the terms we've changed and their replacements, but like I said, we have more work to do. We have a lot of terms that there isn't an exact one-to-one replacement available, or where a term might be appropriate for one collection but not another. So these are going to take time, collaboration, and decision-making. So just to wrap things up with a few parting observations and lessons learned, if you're wondering where to start, I would say start with your collections and the issues you already have on your mind. I'd also recommend limiting yourself to a small number of vocabularies. Take the time to get to know them, how they operate, and how you want to use them. You should also consider long-term maintenance. Terms can and will change. Next, there's no perfect vocabulary. They're all created by people, and we all have our biases. And lastly, it's good to know what Library of Congress is up to, even when you look elsewhere. I think there's value to Library of Congress as a vocabulary, and I am in favor of change proposals and new term proposals. But I'm also not going to hold my breath, and I'm not going to plan my actions around vague statements that they might make, especially those without timelines or accountability. So for example, in March, they announced that they're changing the subject term slaves to enslaved people, which is great, but as of this morning, it still has not gone into effect. So thank you so much for listening. I hope this was interesting or helpful if you've ever wondered about alternate vocabularies and how we use them. All that being said, at the end of the day, we're responsible for our metadata and its impact on staff and users. And we do have the ability to mitigate some of the damage caused by harmful or inaccurate headings. Or in the case of newly created metadata, we have choices to avoid using harmful terminology. In many ways, archives and archivists often have much more freedom to do so than some librarians, both in terms of the systems that we use, like ArchivesSpace, but also because of the nature of archival description. Archival collections do not come with title pages and subject headings already assigned to them. We do not get vendor records. We create description using our professional judgment. So I have my email on here, as well as the link to our LibGuide, where we have all of our ArchivesSpace documentation. Our local manual, which is on that site, includes a section on how we use alternate vocabularies. So please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. I ran a little late in getting started, so we have about 3 minutes for questions. Rachel, are you open to taking questions? She's like, no, just email me. So what we'll do, we only have one microphone, so I will be the runner. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll run to you, and then I'll run the microphone back to you. So we'll probably only have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I also noticed that someone, maybe Rachel, put remediating subject and agent records on the suggestion board. Oh, okay, well, Yeah, so maybe that's a topic we can talk about. I'd love to hear about your failed proposal. uh, yeah. So anyone have a brief question? Okay. It's easier when it's Zoom, right? Because you can like type the question out and think about it and not be the first person to put something in the chat. Oh, all right, I'm coming to you. Yeah, I know. Why do you have to be over there?
Hi, Dan Michelson, Smith College, and thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on ways in which the subjects module, which is very limited in ArchivesSpace, ways it might be improved to sort of make this kind of work easier.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really thought about it too in depth, but just kind of thinking about like what like a subject record, like a subject authority record looks like, might be a place to start. In terms of like variant terms or display terms, because we do like exporting rather than the PUI, but like that might be a way to kind of alleviate some issues if like, you want a particular concept but don't like the actual like label, but like maybe like the 450, one of the 450s, like to use something like that is sort of like top of mind, one of the ideas I had, but I think it is worth exploring because yeah, in comparison to some of the other subject records, it's quite simple. So there may be room to kind of build that functionality in to kind of help with this.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to go ahead and give you a reprieve so you can have some water. Yeah, it sounds like this is probably going to be something we discuss later, and Rachel did share her email address. So yeah, thanks again, Rachel. We're going to go ahead and move into our next presentation for the day. Let me pull those up. All right, I'll let you go ahead and hit play on that while I read your introduction. All right, so our next presenter is Susanna Broyles from Texas State University. She is going to be presenting on implementing ArchivesSpace from start to finish, and finish is in quotes. Texas State University Libraries recently launched ArchivesSpace, incorporating over 300 finding aids for university archives and the Whitliff collections. This presentation will provide a high-level overview of our year-long journey, their year-long journey, not mine. I have very little to do with it. Migrating from 2 different platforms, creating a shared style guide and input manual, performing data cleanup, designing the public user interface, including customizing the PDF downloads on the PUI, and finally having the site go live. Susanna will also discuss tips, tricks, and things that they wish they had known earlier, as well as next steps. Thanks. Here's Susanna.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susanna Broyles, the project archivist at the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University. And like Jessica said, I'm basically going to be talking about our ArchivesSpace implementation. What I'm hoping to provide is the kind of information, lessons, tips, and tricks that I really wish I had known 2 years ago when we started this project. And so I'm going to focus on what went well, along with some of the surprises that we encountered, because there's always surprises. So just as a bit of background, the libraries at Texas State have 2 special collections, University Archives and the Whitliff. We are 2 completely separate entities in the library, and we manage our collections independently. So as you can see, University Archives is the repository documenting the institutional history of Texas State and the local history of Hays County and San Marcos, Texas. And so for ArchivesSpace purposes, the majority of the finding aids are record groups described according to MPLP, although they do have some more traditionally processed presidential and faculty papers. While we at the Whitliff, we document the creative output of Texas and the regional southwestern United States with a focus on literature, film, music, and photography. Our collections are primarily personal papers and manuscripts. And our finding aids are processed with full series, sub-series, and in some cases down to the item level. We do also have preliminary inventories to many collections that have been accessioned to MPLP standards with basic box and folder descriptions. So the first decision we had to make was that we had both repositories share an instance, and that was just purely practical because our collections are relatively small. And while my presentation really focuses on the planning for the WITLib side of the implementation, I will discuss areas where there was need for collaboration and sharing across the ASpace instance, rather. So again, just more background. We have the WITLib, over 150 fully processed manuscript collections and nearly 1,000 of those additional preliminary inventories that range from accessions of a handful of folders to hundreds of linear feet. So there is a wide range of materials. And just so the way it used to be, and actually still is, but that's neither here nor there. So we've been presenting our finding aids up to this point simply through A to Z list of authors and musicians' names, linking to collection pages and then linking out to a printable PDF. There was no way to search across collections or really provide any meaningful subject terms or linked data. Edits and revisions were cumbersome and often simply just not done, and it was outdated. So not really ideal. However, there was one thing that we liked, really our curators liked. They could quickly put up new collection pages and show donors that the material was accessible. So before ASpace, we entered a few finding aids into Archon, but we never really launched it before it became obsolete. At the same time we were doing that, University Archives was using Archivist Toolkit, again, no longer functioning. So it became clear that ArchivesSpace was the answer to both of our problems. So just for visuals, this is our lovely A to Z list. And so with people with intimate knowledge about Southwestern literature and music works perfectly fine. But for those without that subject specialty, not so much. And like I said, then you go into the collection page. This is for one of our authors, John Graves. And then you can get to the printable PDF of his finding aid. So again, every collection is super siloed, and there's basically no way to search across any of them. So, hang on. We have a relatively small team, and as you can see, the WITLib, we have 3 full-time archivists, 1 part-time archives assistant. University Archives has 2 full-time, and then we reached out to the library programmer. We have 1 for our entire library, and to help with the more technical side of the implementation. And so, as part of our preparation, we were originally going to have Leosis provide on-site training for our team, but we scheduled it right after spring break 2020, and that happened. So we ended up being the first online training session that they transitioned to later that fall. Again, thank you, Brittany, Jessica, and Christine. Y'all did amazing work. And so, tip number 1, planning. Plan like you never planned for anything else before. So, thankfully, we had an outside incentive. Our regional aggregator, Texas Archival Resources Online, TARO, was launching a massive overhaul. So we had a deadline of roughly a year to get clean EAD experts to them. So we had a year to completely get ArchivesSpace launched. So that was fun. So priority 1 was to replicate the TARO content. And then priority 2 was to replicate the A to Z list content, which I just showed you. And priority 3 was everything else. So you can see that we really had a game plan. And again, because we like planning, we actually set benchmarks. in a cuddly goals kind of way, just with the targets we wanted to meet in each of those cuddles. And finally, because again, we like planning, we drafted a roadmap for the various short-term goals and action items assigned to various team members. We kept this on a shared team site and met regularly to assess it, update it, and usually celebrate successes. This is a tiny portion of what ours look like, but it goes on for a lot longer. But again, just really keeping ourselves on track. So my second piece of advice is document everything. So we created a shared manual with University Archives. It's a very broad, high-level overview of usage that really focuses on the instance-wide best practices and minimum requirements for fields. It's very basic and includes just instructions on everything from how to create an agent record to how to create collection hierarchy. We purposely kept it very focused on the basic technical usage of ArchivesSpace that we both shared, because we quickly found out that our best practices and standards are very different. So again, and of course it's DAX compliant because we're professionals. You can just see how basic it is, and just it really walks you through everything that you need to create records. But besides other documentation nerds like me, who's going to read 30 pages of this? Not very many people. So we created a quick guide for the WITLIF that focuses on our own standards and the pertinent information that our staff would need to know while entering or editing a record. It documents local usage, gives examples, and the required information for every field. And as a side note, none of our jobs are exclusively based in namespace, so it makes it so much easier to find answers for questions and troubleshoot specific issues rather than having to go through the manual. In that same vein, I also created a frequently asked questions section that I update as needed with any questions that come up from staff. So we have documentation of both how we're using ASpace and what issues have come up in the past. So really just keeping things, just documenting everything that we can. And this is the first page of our quick guide. And I just want to quickly highlight how we structured it. So we went through every single field in the resource record in order and discussed what data we wanted to enter into it and how it should be formatted. So we highlighted it in red if it was required, and adding the appropriate DAX rule if you needed more guidance, and then really went into detail giving real-life WITLIF examples in the purple font. You can see the McCarthy papers and how we use capitalization, and just really breaks it down to the smallest decisions. And basically, this was a wonderful tool to standardize and codify our best practices. And also, it's just easy to use, which was our main idea with this. So we have all these standards and best practices now. And so, instance-wide cleanup time. So, along with University Archives, we cleaned up our shared subject and agent records, which had been imported from 2 different systems from a variety of users, from staff to student workers to volunteers, over the past 25, 30 years. So there was a big variety in what was in there. So we added Library of Congress name authority and subject heading links as applicable. We, of course, deleted duplicates, misspellings, and like Rachel mentioned, we really tried to use more inclusive vocabularies whenever we were able to, most notably Homosaurus, because that's what works best for our collections. Okay, so challenges, because there's always challenges. So we started remediating both the WITLIF and University Archives records. it became quickly evident that both migrations led to some major-ish inconsistencies in the metadata formatting and mapping. So for the first few collections, I thought it'd be easier just to edit the metadata in the records. That didn't last long. I found that deleting the inputted records and starting over with a clean resource record was the best way to proceed. Especially since, as you might be able to see, we had superfluous and more challengingly outdated identifier numbers at the file level. That's a snippet of Dick Revis papers, I think those 150 boxes. And at every file level, there is a Alcon instance collection content number that does not align with anything. So check your EED all the time, because that's not fun to edit. Okay, so basic tip, defaults make everything easier and better. So you can see that we use default text in our note fields and has single-handedly been the biggest help. So it both gives you a visual cue which notes are required, along with not having to worry about the boilerplate text, and especially ensuring proper EAD-friendly formatting for links and other XML formatting issues. Yes, I cannot stress how big of a game changer defaults have been. Okay, so as we got ready to go live with our instance in that September, we started thinking about how to make this instance really our own. And the first thing that we knew is we wanted it to feel like it was part of our library's website. So as a visual, this is our catalog. It's lovely. And we worked with our amazing programmer to make this. And you can see the same maroon banner, the star logo, and also very collection-friendly search tips. So really, we made it as customized as we possibly could. And we really like it. But the one issue that we had with ArchivesSpace was the out-of-the-box PDFs generated on the PUI. So this is the correspondence series of our J. Howard Walmer collection of Comic McCarthy. Try saying that 3 times fast. So our use of the notes field makes the out-of-the-package PDF hard to read and really just not very user-friendly. You can see that all of our notes, the content is, the label is bolded, so that overwhelms the actual title of the item. Let's see. We have a lot of very text-heavy collections, being a literary archive, and the repetition of text gets, well, repetitive very quickly. So we reached out to Hudson Malongo, who was involved with the design of ArchivesSpace's technical architecture, to see if they could help us customize the PDF plugin. Basically, we wanted to know if the PDFs could look like our existing finding aids. So we gave them this wish list. So having the box photo information on the left, not displaying the material format of subject terms at every file level, and using the bold type for series and sub-series headings, but not for every notes label because, like I said, we use notes a lot. And just a generally cleaner, more human-readable look. And they did. And so you can see the difference. On the left is out-of-the-box PDF. On the right is after the Hudson Malongo. And you can see that they pretty much got every item on our wish list. And I can't say how happy we are about this. It's been really helpful for both our researchers and our staff just to have a more readable PDF. And one more visual. The left is the Hudson Malongo. The right is our original finding aids. So again, very, very similar. And so we reached out to James Bolin at Hudson Malongo, and we asked him if there was anything he would want archivists to know about. and he came up with this amazing quote. So also, please note the GitHub link at the top. So please feel free to adapt it to your needs because we are extremely happy with it. And so finally, we finished. Absolutely not. At the same time we are doing this, we also are creating a new Islander digital platform. So now we're trying to link those two. And of course, we're just continuing to add new finding aids and seeing if there's an easier way that we can accession and inventory and community tools via ArchivesSpace. And working with the curators to replicate what we, and they especially, liked about the web-based A to Z listings. And thank you so much. If you have any questions at all or want to see any of our documentations, please reach out. I'm more than happy to share. Thanks.
Thank you, Susanna. I will go ahead and cut this question off. If you would be willing to share your documentation, if you could send that to me, I will link it in the wiki. So yeah, that sounds good. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. We're running a little behind, but we'll still take a full 15-minute break, I promise. So if there are any questions for Susanna before we move on. The pause is a lot less awkward on Zoom. All right. Thank you, Susanna. All right. Well, then we'll just go ahead and move on to our last presentation before the break. Taylor. Good, you're right here. Go ahead and let you pull that up while I read your introduction. All right. So, like I said, our last presentation before the break is implementing a barcode and scanning inventory system for improved collection management. Your presenter is Taylor Wolford from North Carolina State University Archives. In this presentation, Taylor will discuss the ongoing efforts of NC State University Library's Special Collections Research Center to implement a barcoding and scanning system for inventory management through ArchivesSpace. In the past, departmental staff have collaborated on a project to apply barcodes to every container in the repository while standardizing and applying container profiles in ArchivesSpace. This presentation will give an overview of their progress on the project while discussing logistical issues in regards to barcoding their collections for future access. Taylor will also discuss NC State's vision for the project at its conclusion, such as using the space calculator tool in ArchivesSpace to improve their physical collection management capabilities. Thanks, Taylor.
Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Wolford. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a Special Collections Librarian at NC State University Libraries. Thank you for that long introduction. I realize now that I wrote that kind of a long, little, brief intro. So stay with me here. I know it's already in the morning, but I hope you find this as interesting as I did. For the past year, I have been project manager for implementing a barcode and scanning inventory system, and we are applying that to every container in our collection, of which there are thousands upon thousands. So it's a very big project. I'd like to also recognize our project contributors. So Hannah Chapman is now a collection management assistant at BYU, but when she was working for us, she was a graduate assistant, and this whole project is her brainchild. She came up with this, she implemented our workflows, and when she left, I sort of took it over, and we're now working off of everything she created, essentially. And this project would not have been able to be completed without our graduate assistants and our undergraduate assistants who are doing the bulk of the barcoding itself, as well as some of our staff members who are helping manage the project. So our project goals, first we wanted to implement a barcode system to manage our collections more effectively. So for context, we have technically 3 shelving facilities at NC State for our Special Collections Department, and that includes both university archive records and special collection records. So we have the BookBot, which is as cool as it sounds. It's essentially a mechanical librarian shelving unit that we have at our fancy new library. And we store very little there, so we were a little bit less concerned about managing those collections. They're also less highly accessed on average. So we were more focused on our off-site shelving facility storage, as well as our on-site shelving facility, which is in our library where our special collections reading room is located. So the plan was to essentially manually barcode every container we had in those two repositories and implement that into ArchivesSpace. Second goal was sort of, because we were doing this barcode project simultaneously, we thought it'd be a good idea to conduct a pretty extensive shelf read. And as the students were going through and barcoding, they could notate any items that were missing or mislocated or potentially mislabeled in our collections. So for the past year, we've conducted this shelf read and worked on resolving any missing items if possible. And I say if possible because sometimes it's not, unfortunately, but that has been a really great benefit to us with our collection management policies as well. And then the last step was, our last goal was standardizing locations and container profiles in ArchivesSpace, with the goal of eventually using a space and extent calculator in ArchivesSpace to be able to understand how much space we had left in our repositories and where that space could be located. Okay. So for our workflows, we have an ArchivesSpace manager. He's in charge of maintenance and management of our ArchivesSpace, and he was able to generate a spreadsheet that had a list of all containers in our repositories that don't have barcodes. Previously, we were very inconsistent in barcoding our materials. For some reason, someone decided one time to barcode a whole collection and then barcode other parts of a collection, and that's all we had really. So we needed to know what was barcoded and where those items were in our repositories. So then we would physically apply the barcodes to the containers and scan them into the spreadsheet that was generated by our ArchivesSpace manager. We could send him back this spreadsheet that he would then be able to bulk upload all of those unique barcode numbers into ArchivesSpace and apply them to the container that they were supposed to be applied to. And then our fourth part of the process was reviewing and resolving mysteries, which, as I said, could get quite complicated. And where we are at now is 5 and 6. So we're in the process of bulk adding container profiles to everything that we have in ArchivesSpace and all of the objects that have been barcoded, so that we are able to use more space calculation tools in ArchivesSpace. And then lastly, general cleanup. So here is a little bit more in depth about how we are doing the barcode scanning. You can see on the right here, that's what a shelf looks like after we finished barcoding it. So we have our Access Services Department is basically sending us sheets upon sheets of these barcodes with unique identifiers. They're the same barcodes that are applied to general circulation books, so it works perfectly in our system for what we need as well. We attach physically the barcodes to every container in our 2 main storage facilities, and then we are able to integrate those barcodes into ArchivesSpace, which is also fully integrated with our Special Collections request management system, which is really great, and I can talk about that a little bit more. So here is our working spreadsheet for barcode integration. As you can see, this was the report that was generated for us by our ArchivesSpace manager, and it includes information such as the collection, where it's physically located, which would be the range, the shelf, and the section, and satellite is our larger offsite shelving facility. And then column E, top container barcode, was a column that he created so that we could add essentially the barcode scans directly into the spreadsheet, and we could then send this to him for uploading. So it's a pretty easy process, fairly quick. Although a year does not sound quick, it was fairly quick for what we were doing. And then this is ideally what we like moving forward. As you can see, Phil Freelon's papers, really great architect who built some structures for the Smithsonian. We now have our current location, which we know and have verified is correct. We have our unique barcodes, and then we have our container profiles and how they are measured in the dimensions. This is our retrieval management system. It's called Circa. It's created in-house and fully integrated with ArchivesSpace. So This is sort of the other side of what you just saw in ArchivesSpace in terms of the Phil Freelon papers. So it includes the box and the barcode number. And we use this system to check materials in and out to our researchers so that we can keep track of who's requesting what and when. And now, instead of manually entering in what they've requested and checked in and out, we just scan it with the barcode, and it's been checked in, check it back in, or check it back out or in with the barcode scanner as well. So our desk students have really liked this. It's made their process a lot easier for facilitating access to the collections. And we've been able to basically fully integrate ArchivesSpace and our barcode scanning project into this interface. We also conducted, as I said, an extensive shelf read. So unfortunately, the more materials you get, the more likely it is that you could lose them, which is hard to say as an archivist, I know. But we have thousands upon thousands of boxes, folders, tubes, etc. So in a lot of cases, the shelf read did require extensive searching and guesswork. People frequently remove parts of a collection and put it into another part of the collection, but they don't delete the original ArchivesSpace record. Very common thing we came across, and that required us to sort of put our little detective caps on and be like, well, I don't think this is here anymore, and move on. We also created, as a part of the shelf read project, and by we, I mean mostly the graduate assistant students who did a lot of this work, a mysteries documentation that we shared with the entire departmental staff. So this includes every container type that we found that was missing or a mystery, and it also includes information such as the collection number and the box information and where it should have been but was not. Okay. So for updating container profiles, this is part of the project I dread the most and have been sort of avoiding. Primarily because our department, again, was very inconsistent in adding container profiles to anything ever. So we have been sort of trying to decide a systematic way of applying container profiles in a similar way to how we did with applying barcodes to all of our all of our containers. So we're toying with the option of either using bulk operations in top containers to bulk add top container profiles, or to use some of our reporting capabilities, like possibly generating another spreadsheet of all the containers that don't have container profiles in our repository and seeing if we can add them that way. So that's something that's still a work in progress. But like I said, it really is a huge goal of ours with this project so that we can enable staff to better utilize extent and space calculators. As we are running out of room, it's more and more important to know where we have space left in our repositories. So I already showed this, but this is the ideal for us in terms of container profiles. I think the complications come less so with letter size boxes in your more standard size archival boxes, and more so with our oversized materials. And we have a significant amount of custom boxes in our repository that are created by our preservation lab. So that is going to require someone with a ruler or a yardstick physically measuring the materials, and again, that's part of why this process is going to take us a little bit longer. So current project status, side note, this is inaccurate. We've since barcoded thousands more containers, but when I made this 2 weeks ago, this is where we were at. So we've barcoded on the left-hand side, or I guess, yeah, that side over there. That's how many materials we have barcoded at our largest off-site shelving facility. So it's thousands, as you can see, 23,000 boxes, 7,100 flat folders, so on and so forth. It's a really, really impressive amount of stuff that we've done in this span of time. And unfortunately, as embarrassing as this is to say, we did have 600 mysteries or missing items, but I am happy to report we've solved all but 31. So our university archivist came into the room when I sent out that report, and he's like, I can't believe it. And I was like, me neither. So that's really exciting for us. And I do think, like, moving forward, it's just a good idea to know what you know that you don't know where something is, at least. So next steps, we want to finish barcoding in our second storage facility, which, as I mentioned, is in our main library. And we'd also like to standardize and or create container profiles using potentially the merge feature, or bulk create container profiles with a project spreadsheet template that we've done. And we also need to measure and create container profiles for our custom boxes. Challenges and lessons learned. So this is definitely a team effort. We pretty much consistently have had 2 people barcoding every day for a year if they're working. And I also barcode in my spare time as much as possible. I know some of my colleagues have barcoded and tried to resolve mysteries as much as they possibly could. So it's definitely a team effort, and it does require working together for multiple long periods of time. And another part of this that hurts me to say is that not all mysteries can be resolved. There are just things that processors have done that, legacy materials and collections that we just can't solve what those mysteries are at this time. Doesn't to say that they'll never be solved, but I'm willing to let that go for the time being. And then also institutional knowledge can be a great resource. So our university archivist has been there for 15 years, I think, and he is just a mecca of knowledge. He knows all, so he's been a great resource in helping us resolve a lot of these things. And lastly, this is my last huge point and emphasis with this project is that processors really anyone who works with collections needs to be trained on this barcode system, both from the ArchivesSpace processing standpoint, but also the retrieval and management system standpoint. And they also need to understand that we're adding barcodes and we are adding container profiles to everything now. I don't want 5 years down the line someone to be like, wow, they're really inconsistent with their barcodes. And we do this all over again. So my goal is that this becomes a part of our regular processing manual, a part of our processing workflows, and we never have to do this again. So that is where we are at right now. And thank you for listening. If anyone has any questions, I don't know if we have time, but hi.
We do have time. It's already in hand. Thank you, Taylor.
All right. Hello, my name is Patricia Nava. I'm from the University of Texas at Dallas, Curator of Aviation Archives. So I see I'm on the right track. That is really very wonderful. I appreciate this, all your work and the presentation. Thank you for that. My question now is, do you barcode really every session as well, or just the resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our process right now is that we provide access to everything that we accession immediately. So we don't have a backlog. All of our collections are minimally processed and readily available, which means we do have to barcode the accessions because people can request them completely unprocessed. And so for our retrieval and management system, we sort of need to know where those are going to be. We do apply barcodes essentially to everything that comes in now. Yes.
I know it's not part of your presentation, but I'd like to know more about making things available as soon as they're a session, because that sounds terrifying.
Hi, Kevin Schlopman, Columbia University Rare Book Manuscript Library. Thank you, very inspiring. I saw some nice looking locations in there as well. Did you have to do location work before you could do this? Was that part of the setup for this project?
Yes, so that's another really fun aspect of the project I did not go into. We actually had to create space in our repository. A lot of our oversized boxes didn't fit where they were at, so we created new organizational spaces for those. But we also had to standardize our location profiles because in a lot of cases, a shelf would be 0, 1, and the shelf next to it would be just 1, and that bothered me, but it also was confusing for people who were typing in, range number, shelf number, and then drawer 1 versus 0, 1, it wouldn't always populate. So we had to simultaneously do the barcoding, the standardization of the locations, and the container profiles in a lot of cases to make sure that moving forward, everything was a lot easier to locate in ArchivesSpace.
Hi, Brianna McLaughlin from the Indiana University Libraries. And I was just wondering if you encountered any resistance from stakeholders for this project. I guess I ask because we have been trying to do a very similar project and have encountered resistance, to say the least.
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think we probably would have had more resistance if we were suggesting that all of these boxes and containers would be ingested into our general catalog, but we have our own retrieval management system for maintaining collections. So really we only needed to be concerned about whether or not we could fully integrate our barcodes into Circa, which is how we send materials around campus. Other than that, we sort of operated on a silo and just did what we wanted. So, and I know that's not realistic. I know it's not. I mean, I'm sure a lot of places would have more of an issue with it, but we were able to explain the benefits very clearly to the director of the libraries, and he was fully supportive, so it was fairly easygoing, although I don't think they thought it was going to take as long as it did. So that's just something to consider.
Thanks. Yeah, and Circa is available right on GitHub if anyone wants to use that. And I will say to you and Susanna, things taking a year in archives is light speed, so I don't know why they thought it took a long time.
Hi, Valerie Adonisio, Atlas Systems. This is just a comment to another comment. I found that getting your insurance risk assessors involved is a fun way to get over resistance. Our materials are worth a lot of money, and there is a business case to make in a different way that we're not used to making, that your control over your inventory represents an asset to your institution that has financial implications as well.
Thanks, Valerie. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Seeing none. Thank you, Taylor. Yeah. All right. We're going to go ahead and move into our break. We're a couple minutes behind, so let's round up and say it's 10:20. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back at 10:35. Refreshments in the back, like I said. Restrooms are through the double doors and right out that way. And please suggest some more suggestion topics. If there's one you're already interested in, just put a +1 next to it, and that's a vote. But yeah, we'll be back in 15 minutes. All right, everybody. I feel bad making the conversation stop because it's so exciting to be talking to people. It's been a really long time. Let's go ahead and get seated. Make sure you did top off your drink. If you need to make sure you have enough coffee or a water, they're going to come and remove the beverages at 11, so just keep that in mind. Yeah, it was actually a fun break to get to talk to everybody. So definitely, I'm glad we have some discussion time at the end. I see that there are a lot more suggestions that have been made. And, you know, if you don't want to sit in a discussion topic that gets proposed, we can also just talk, too. So maybe, you know, we can find some space in the room just to have some chats, because it was really nice catching up with everyone in person and hearing what's going on with everybody. But our next presentation, if you want to go ahead and, I don't know how everyone wants to present their stuff, but our next presentation is Embracing a Culture of Change. Valerie Adonisio from Atlas Systems is going to be your presenter. Think back to your workflows before you adopted ArchivesSpace. How often did they change? This lightning round is a prompt to celebrate and embrace the fact that the ArchivesSpace team works hard to deliver multiple releases a year, but that the pace of that development process requires us to anticipate, plan, and adopt changes faster than ever before. This session will have some tips and tricks to think about for adopting a culture of change around plugins, staff training, and routines as they relate to ongoing releases. Thanks, Valerie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Jessica. So I read off my slides. We'll see how this goes. So think back to your workflows before you adopted ArchivesSpace. Really, think back to them. Those halcyon days where nothing ever changed. I bet that most of those workflows were relatively stable for long periods. If you used Archon, AT, or the EAD cookbook, those applications and practices stayed the same for a long time, whole careers worth of time. You may have established and invested in a decade plus of practice that was comfortable and predictable, and so did the people around you. But ArchivesSpace has changed, will change, and will always change. But and frequently, 3.3.3 release candidate is available right now. You might miss that comfortable old groove, or you may still be in one, and I am here to force you out of it with reality. Changes to ASpace can be both technical as well as functional. By functional, I mean a new feature, like top container merging, or the spreadsheet importer, or new support for EAC, or a new subrecord. These are all callbacks to the last few major releases. These have impacts on staff or student training. I loved that gorgeous guide that Susanna showed us, but what happens when she has to go back and update that? By technical, I mean changes to the code you cannot see, including how pages render, configurations removed or added, and deeper infrastructure changes an average user will never detect until something changes and it goes wrong for you. These have impacts on plugins, theming, and sometimes come with decisions, like what are we setting this configuration to, true or false? Frequent version releases means changes in both of these categories, the functional and the technical. This presentation is a series of prompts, followed by suggestions for your consideration. I will be encouraging you to accept a culture of change. Sorry. Actively prepare for that change, and identify what you wish to improve about your update workflow if you have one. So let's talk about your update landscape. As it is right now, let's start with the basics. How do you hear about updates? Do you usually hear about them before a release or after? Who makes the decision to update and when? Is there one person in your workplace that makes that call? Is it you? Is it a group of people who says, yes, it's time to move on to another version? Or does that decision get made for you by your service provider or IT person? That person sends you an email, new release is out, we're updating. How often do you update? Do you do that with every new version? Or when you hear about a new cool thing, any accessioning archivists in the room, pay attention to 3.3.0. Do you feel prepared for updates when they occur? Red text is scary. Do you track changes to ArchivesSpace and whether those changes will impact your workflows? Do you do that proactively or reactively? Do staff meet to discuss or coordinate forthcoming updates and changes? to workflows? Do you schedule retraining or new training when updates come out? Again, proactively or reactively. A staff member comes to you and says, hey, there's this new button. How am I supposed to use it? Did you know that new button was on the way? Now you have to reactively go back and train staff. Has anything ever broken for you during an update? Did it cause significant disruption? All of a sudden you can't load ArchivesSpace anymore because your PUI will not let ArchivesSpace run. You are now down. Do you know there's an AS roadmap? And the keyword search terms for that would be ArchivesSpace roadmap. And of course, everyone reads the release notes multiple times in detail for every version. So let's talk about your A-Space landscape. Do you know what version you're on? Quick. Who knows what version they're on? Raise your hands. Up, up. Hesitance. Okay, good. Is that the most recent version? People who raised your hands. Yes. Confident yeses. Some maybe no's. Do you have a sandbox? And I don't mean the sandbox, which is available at the sandbox.archivespace.org. I mean one with your actual data in it and your actual configurations. This is what I call a true sandbox, where you're looking at your stuff, not whatever happens to be online. Do you know what plugins and theming you have installed? Do you test your plugins after each update? Loving these answers from the back corner. Do you remove plugins when plugins get folded into code? Do you even know what that sentence means? Do you know what configurations you have in place? Do you test your configurations? And do you have a custom PDF style sheet? Thank you to Susanna for mentioning that. Oh, I hope that's your name, Susanna. I think it is. So here are my suggestions after prompting you with uncomfortable questions for the first half of the presentation. Were you happy with your answers? Did you have them? Was there any frustration there? The first piece of advice is to go back and answer those questions and identify which questions you wish you had better answers to, not do, and which don't matter. Sometimes, maybe not all of those things matter, and that's okay. Maybe you don't have a lot of plugins, you can skip completely over that section. And now here comes way too many suggestions after way too many questions. Suggestion, oops. Consider a sandbox if you don't have one already. I would never live without one, and this is my first suggestion. But make sure that sandbox is a real mirror. Same plugins, same configurations, same plugins, same everything. How do you get one? This question would be directed to whoever manages your current instance of ArchivesSpace. If you have a hosting provider, they likely offer one. And do you know about test.archivespace.org? So this is a different kind of a sandbox. This is where new code is available at all times. So if you do not have a sandbox and you have no ability to bring up a new version yourself, you can preview changes that are coming down the pike by going to test.archivespace.org. Consider testing release candidates if you don't do this already. More work for you, but this is a presentation about updates. Only do this on a sandbox if you have one, or on a local dev install if you have one. This benefits everyone. The earlier problems are known, the better. Testing release candidates with real data is seriously helpful to the community, and testing RCs gives you a vital preview of any issues with plugins, branding, or the need for training ahead of a formal release. It extends your timeline by at least 2 weeks to get yourself ready for that new release. As long as you test it thoroughly. Just installing a release candidate and seeing if it loads, yes, that is the reason for celebration, but are you really testing it? Read the release notes. You might not understand everything that's there, and that is fine. Release notes can be a little intimidating because what is a PR and what are all of these configurations? Read it anyway. Please read them. See the community at work by reading about community contributors, and pull requests. Tip your cap to the program team, devs, councils, and core committers, all of whom are putting work into the changes behind those release notes. Use the release notes to celebrate windfalls or improved workflows by knowing the details of every release, but also anticipate concerns or complications by reading about new requirements, new configurations, and everything I'm mentioning today. Maintain and update checklist of steps to take when preparing for and assessing an update. Assign or share responsibility for the checklist. I get to say that because I don't work where you work. Embrace the fact that this will repeat, and it will repeat often, 2 to 3 times a year, maybe even 4. And if I were making a checklist, it might look like these next few slides. Maintain and check a list of plugins and their behavior. List every plugin on your production server and your sandbox. Just starting with that is a good activity. Do you know every, oops, I went ahead, but do you know every plugin on every server? You will again get this list from your hosting provider or IT person. Check each plugin's source page for version and compatibility information if available. So not only do you have to anticipate the updates to ArchivesSpace core code, you are running a series of plugins that may also be either out of sync or have new versions available, and you have to be responsible for knowing what version of a plugin you are running as well, and whether it is compatible with the current version of ArchivesSpace or the version that you're anticipating. So sometimes update activities are both about updating ArchivesSpace, but also going back to your pages for every single plugin and updating the plugin as well. Or the plugin development is slightly behind ArchivesSpace's development. You want to move forward to the next version, but your plugin isn't ready yet. Determine what each of those plugins do. So you have your list, but what do they do? Now, after years of use and onboarding, staff might not realize the differences in functionality of core code versus plugins. And I have had this service request. ArchivesSpace, it's broken, it's not doing this thing. Also, I'm a new employee. And I'm like, oh, your old institution had 6 awesome plugins installed, none of which are installed on your new thing. But you think ArchivesSpace is broken because you don't know that all of the functionality that you were benefiting from in the past was a plugin. Not her fault. But what do you do? Do you know what your plugins do? For example, after years of using TimeWalk, you would be rudely surprised to learn that ArchivesSpace does not automatically parse states. But would you notice if it stopped working? You'd notice if ArchivesSpace won't load, but would you really notice if one of your plugins stopped working? Determine how to test each of the plugins on your list. So what's a quick way to know that your plugin still works the way you expect? Most plugins will come from the community, but some may have been developed in-house, and in-house plugins are usually related to branding and theming. These are at risk when the code behind pages change, especially to the PUI. This is usually for good reasons. That code is changing for good reasons, like improving accessibility or new feature requests. But if you have in-house plugins, where does that code live? Who wrote that code? Do they still work where you work? Do they read the release notes? And here it is a real example. This is a snippet from the release notes from version 2.8.0, and I know that's a while ago, but this was a perfect example. Look at the text at the bottom. You may need to update any plugins to override these files. Someone who wrote a plugin who used these files is going to look at that, know immediately. Do you know immediately? Maintain and check a list of vital workflows. For example, do you export as part of your workflows? Maybe to MARC or EAD, maybe to EAC. Surely those standards won't change, right? They're standards. The next presentation proves this isn't true. Thank you, Kevin. Importers and exporters change. Unless you're confident that you know every single change in code, test every single aspect of your workflows. This means testing whatever your staff are dependent on, even exports. Check in on preferences and permissions. New features sometimes come with new permission options. Revisit your permissions and users after updates or on a semi-annual basis. This isn't going to kill you, but if you have a new feature and your staff can't use it because of permissions, then, you know. So I say a semi-annual basis. I used to have a calendar set for this. I would check on my permissions and things every 4 months. The new agents module and custom reporting are both examples of when the permissions menus changed as a result of new features being added. Updates also bring changes to the preferences menu itself, including 330. Abrupt ending, because I wasn't sure how the timing was going to go. And remember, without change, we wouldn't get to see kittens turn into cranky old cats. I love cranky old cats. They get arthritic and cranky. They need special food. I have time for questions, I assume? Or I could give you back time in your day.
Thank you, Valerie. I don't know if we were just encouraged or fussed at, but I really appreciate it. It's always great. Valerie always has a really engaging and educational presentation. And now we know she likes cranky cats that require medicated food. Old dogs are better than puppies. Yeah. But do we have any questions unrelated to pets? Okay. Oh, all right, cool. Right, yeah, they feel good about themselves right now.
So I was curious if there's a place where folks are sharing their testing criteria or testing sort of checklists, because that would be very useful to add.
I'm going to make a note to send this to Jessica afterwards. The testing, I'm going to close my eyes because I'm not sure about this. I believe that the testing subgroup of the Technical Advisory Council, or a shared group of the Technical Advisory and User Advisory Councils, has a testing checklist that they use to run through checks that I'm sure is publicly available. All I have to do is go and find that link. So I'm going to make a note of that right now, and I'll put this in my comments for Jessica to put on the wiki.
Yeah, they do have an extensive testing protocol. I don't know if it's publicly available or not, so that's the one.
Yeah,
You will check, yeah.
Just to follow up on that, yes, the testing sub-team is publicly available. It's on the wiki. Also, at the last online forum, Joshua Shaw and I of the testing sub-team talked a little bit about that testing process, and he and I actually also talked about how we do testing locally at Dartmouth and NYU. At NYU, we have our testing workflow up on our LibGuide, and I can share that with you too if you want to come find me. So.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, and a recording of that presentation that Rachel just mentioned from the online forum is available online. Any other questions? All right, thank you, Valerie. All right, and like Valerie teased, next up we have Kevin Schlopman. Let's see, this one's yours. I'll let you go ahead and set it up like you want it while I pull up your bio. All right, so next up, we have a year in review, the ArchivesSpace Metadata Standards Subteam. Kevin Schlopman from Columbia University is going to be presenting for the team. The Metadata Standards subgroup of the ArchivesSpace Technical Advisory Council, or TAC, supports the ArchivesSpace community by taking a transparent and proactive approach to documenting the metadata standards used by the ArchivesSpace application and monitoring the standards landscape. Inspired by the enthusiastic reception to the metadata standards presentation at the online forum in March, the subgroup will share highlights of its work over the past year, including improved documentation of the MARC importer, now with DAX mappings, ! As well as plans for next year. Kevin?
Great, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. And I'm at Columbia University, head of archives processing at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, but I'm here with my metadata standards subgroup hat on. So that's the position from which I will be speaking. First, I'd like to read this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the sacred land where we gather today. This land, home to the Massachusetts people, is the place of the Blue Hills. We also wish to be good neighbors to all nations and peoples here in the Dawnland region, otherwise known as New England, including the Abenaki, Micmac, Maliseet, Narragansett, Nipmuc, Passamaquoddy, Pawtucket, Pennacook, Penobscot, Pequot, Wampanoag, and those we have omitted either due to colonial erasure or our own ignorance. The North American Indian Center of Boston has served the indigenous community since 1969. Among other activities, the NAICB organizes performance, exhibit, lectures, etc. And while we were in Boston, I would encourage you to take a moment and learn about the NAICB and the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights here as well as in your own community. And I want to thank Courtney Chartier, the current president of SAA, for a couple more days for sharing this. This is the land acknowledgement that SAA will be using during the upcoming conference. So what is the metadata standards subgroup of the ArchivesSpace tech? As you just heard in the introduction, we support the AS community. We exist to look at how ArchivesSpace interacts with external metadata standards. These are things like MARC, EAD, EACCPF, Dublin Core, DAX, RIC, VRA Core, any number of standards that are out there, and there's a lot of them. This group is about 4 or 5 years old. It came about because there were a lot of metadata questions that were coming to TAC, and there was no body within TAC to actually address them. So that group was formed. I've been on that group since the beginning. And we are, I think, 4 or 5 years old now. This is the past year's group and the upcoming group. A special shout out to Valerie, who was our team lead in 2021-22 and kept us on track and really helped us complete a lot of the great work that I'm about to talk about. It is hard to be a team lead for these subgroups. There's a lot of administration, and this is all people, and these are all people who have full-time jobs already, and we're doing this work as professional service. That can be very hard to get a group of 4 or 5 people to set some goals and actually find the time to achieve them. So thank you, Valerie, for leading us in this past year. And Regina Heberlein, who's not here, but she's taken over as lead of the group for next year and will be encouraging us to continue some of the work that we do. So what do we actually do on a day-to-day or week-by-week basis? We look at tickets that are filed into the ArchivesSpace JIRA. For those of you who don't know, basically all the changes that come to the ArchivesSpace product are ultimately ticketed, and that's how the work actually gets done by the developers. So when there's a ticket that touches on metadata, we actually get tagged. There's a tag that says metadata standard subgroup review, and we take a look at those, and we will opine on them. That can involve just saying, yes, this is right, or doing some research, or working with the community, with the developers to figure out what the actual solution is. A recent example, there was a ticket filed that the country code that was being exported into the MARC 008 field was incorrect for the Netherlands. So we looked into it, and in fact, that was correct because ArchivesSpace had been set up to look to ISO 3166 country codes and put that into MARC, but MARC actually has its own set of country codes that exist completely independently of that, and they are not interchangeable. So the data that was getting into MARC 008 field was actually incorrect for the country code. And nobody in the United States of America noticed because there is a special set of 3 lines of code that said, if you're in the US, put in this code. So it's quite possible this has been noticed before in the last 10 years, and rather than fixing the mapping, somebody just put in that little bit of code that made it work for the US. So that's the kind of thing that we encounter, but we said, yes, that is correctly the issue, and we propose that the correct set of MARC country codes be shipped with ArchivesSpace. And I believe that change is actually going to be coming out in the next version or very soon. It's underway. So that's a tiny example, but that's the kind of stuff that we deal with. We also look at import-export mappings. I'm going to talk about that quite a bit in a moment. We do some special projects. And let me see if I can get this live link to work here. Live internet, always I'm going to say no. Yeah. No, it does not. All right. But there is a set of publicly available documentation, and I have a link further on in the presentation that will link to the work plan, which actually describes what each of the subgroups plans to do every year. So what did we do in 2021-22? We did lots of that ticket review, but the big thing that we did is we completed a complete review of the published mappings for the ArchivesSpace MARC importer. There's a big old spreadsheet that says when you import a MARC record into ArchivesSpace, the 245 goes into this field, and the 5XX goes into that field. This is an extremely useful spreadsheet. Unfortunately, it hadn't been updated since 2013. And even when it was created in 2013, it wasn't entirely accurate at that time. I've been on the group for 4.5 years now, and we've been trying to update this thing ever since the beginning. And it's so big and it's so complex that we just had a hard time making a lot of progress. But we finally finished it. And we did that, we did a combination of bringing in, just doing test records, seeing what happened, as well as actually looking at the mappings that are in the code. We found a bunch of issues. We created tickets for those. We also added, and I think this is critical, DAX elements. So if we saw that a mark field had a one-to-one DAX correspondence, we actually noted that in the spreadsheet. This is really important because we're archivists, we're not bibliographers, we're not librarians, and DAX is our descriptive standard that we use. And one of the issues with maintaining the mark importer is that it tried to do all things for all people. So I was importing dozens of 5xx fields, things like the 514 data quality field. This is a mark field that allows librarians to describe the data quality of data sets and/or cartographic materials. I'm willing to bet a fair amount of money that nobody here, and possibly ever in the history of ArchivesSpace, has actually used the 514 to import actionable data into AS. I'm pretty sure about that. And yet this thing takes up 10 lines of code and is something that has to be tested and maintained. And so what we are trying to do is socialize the idea that we would like to simplify the mark importer in particular quite a bit and really focus on those elements that are relevant for DAX, relevant for archivists, and deprecate and ideally eventually remove those elements. We floated this in March 2022 at our online forum. I'm floating it again here. We haven't actually proposed the tickets yet or done any of that, but I think this is a way forward that will make this spreadsheet much more maintainable in the future. So we don't end up in a similar situation 10 years from now where we have a 10-year-old spreadsheet that is completely out of date. And really one that is very important. I ran into this at Columbia when we did our first migration into ArchivesSpace. We were using MARC records. And of course, I looked to this document to try and figure out where stuff was going to map to and found out very quickly that this was not going to be a useful document for us. And anybody who uses MARC in their workflows, publication workflows, anything like that, similarly, you want to be able to have something you can rely on. So we're very proud of this. This something we've heard a lot about. Just to show you a quick example here. I'm not going to link out because I can't, but essentially you have the mark field, subfield, different behaviors, and then out this way, if I'd had live internet somewhere over here, you have the DAX field mappings, whether it's repeatable core code, and then if we actually filed any tickets about it, we have a link to the ticket there as well. So really, all the information that you need to know about how MARC imports act in ArchivesSpace is now here, finally, and we are super excited about it. Going forward, we're going to do the same thing for EAD, starting in this term. I think EAD is actually going to be relatively simpler because the EAD data model fits much more closely with the ArchivesSpace data model. It is, after all, an archive standard rather than a bibliographic standard, so it's much more closely aligned with DAX and with AS. But similarly, that spreadsheet has not been reviewed in many years. So we just want to make sure that we are correctly asserting to the community that when we say EAD 2002 is going to do X when it comes into AS, that is actually correct. We're also going to keep talking about the idea of tiers of support for different kinds of standards. This is something that came up right at the beginning when I started on metadata standards. Somebody said, I want to have the ability to import VRA core code and export VRA core records. And the group discussed this, and it was very clear to us that VRA core was not important enough in the community to justify limited ArchivesSpace development resources and our resources to actually make this part of ArchivesSpace. But we didn't really have a basis for why we would say that. And coming out of that was this idea of tiers of support, where there are certain standards that we in ArchivesSpace really do have to support because they're widely used in the community, they're important to the community. Things like MARC, for better or for worse. Many of us, maybe all of us, or nearly all of us, use MARC records for both import and export. EAD 2002 is a well-embraced standard. EAC CPF is the existing standard for structuring agent information. But then we get into things like EAD 3 or potentially EAD 4, which is coming out soon as well. And for those at the moment, we are looking at those, and it is possible that someday EAD3 will be an important enough standard that we want to fully support that in every possible way. But at the moment, we are using this idea of tiers of support to say EAD3, it's there, it works, that's great. Until it's more widely used in the community, we're not going to spend a lot of time and effort on making sure that is fully correct. There's also going to be a task force that we're going to propose to document the ArchivesSpace data model. This is something that hasn't been done since the beginning when ArchivesSpace was first written. So that's an idea that's coming out of metadata standards, but will be a TAC-wide activity. And then, of course, we're always taking a look at research changes in standards, things like the ongoing DAX update, recent EAC CPF changes, or EAD4, if and when that comes to fruition. What can y'all do? Lots of things could be helpful. Writing or commenting on tickets can be extremely helpful. I know that can be a little bit overwhelming. If you look at the JIRA board, there's a lot of tags in different states and all this kind of stuff. But it's a nice community. You're not going to break anything by putting the wrong comment or the comment in the wrong place. Somebody will move it to the right place and say, that's okay, thanks for your feedback. And if that itself is still too intimidating, you can always contact somebody on metadata standards or just reach out to Jessica or Christine who can route you in the right direction if you have a thought about how something should import or export or other thoughts about metadata standards. Do take a look at the mappings. The link is in the next slide. Let us know what you think. It's in spreadsheet form right now. That's the least bad way we have of presenting this information, but there are probably better ways. That spreadsheet is still pretty hard to work with. You can tell us about other standards you might like ArchivesSpace to support and why. Maybe VRA Core's time has really come. It's just not something that the folks on the subgroup have seen. Let us know, make the case, and we'll see what we can do. And then finally, just the folks here, I think by attending here are already interested in using or are using ArchivesSpace. Consider joining TAC or the related UAC, the User Advisory Council. It's a great way to get to know other folks using the systems and to give back and continue to maintain and improve ArchivesSpace, which is a system that we're using, and I'm thrilled to be using it. It seems like it's the first fully fledged archival content management system that's really been fully embraced, at least in this country, and I'm excited to see it to continue to develop. So thanks very much. Link to the wiki spaces where all of our work is shared, the work plans, our meeting minutes, all that kind of good stuff. This is the kind of crazy link to the import-exporter mappings, but once you see the slides, you can just click it. My email and my Twitter handle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. All of those links in the slides that we link on the wiki, they will be clickable, so you'll be able to access all of that stuff in the slides when they're provided after the fact. Do we have any questions about the work that the metadata standards subteam's been doing? Like Kevin said, everyone here, everyone on that team has a real job. They're doing this sort of in service to the community, and it is hard work. It's invisible a lot of times, and it's really, really important. So anytime you see something come across with metadata standards, pay attention to it because it might impact you, or probably it will impact you, and if you don't know what's coming, it will impact you negatively. All right. Oh.
Thanks. I just want to reiterate and emphasize Kevin's point about creating and commenting on JIRA tickets. Just on my end, as leading a development prioritization subteam, that's like the #1 thing we are looking for, because it's hard to say, as even more with perhaps with metadata standards, desired features, whether people who wants it besides this one person. So if you ever have a thought about ArchivesSpace, metadata or otherwise, something you want, please submit a ticket. Look, if there's an existing one, comment on it. If you're not sure if there's an existing one, you can't find it, just submit it. That's Christine's responsibility, one of her many, to determine if it's a duplicate, and that'll still be useful because we'll know more than one person wants it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Everyone on UAC and TAC, they they know what they know and they have their experience, but they don't work at your organization. So like you said, maybe VRA, it's time for VRA Core and we don't know it. Any other questions? Thanks, Valerie. And while I'm walking to Valerie, there are instructions for how to comment on a JIRA ticket available on our wiki, how to create one, how to give feedback, how to report a bug. All those instructions are there.
I just want to prompt for the room. If you're on UAC or TAC, raise your hand. These are the people also you can ask questions to. Look and see if your neighbors are around if you're interested in serving.
Right. All right, thank you, Kevin. Final plug, as ArchivesSpace members, you are eligible to serve on any of our councils. So just by being in this room, you are eligible. So next time you see the request for volunteers, come around. Don't hesitate. We're friendly. In the spring, yeah. All right, Sarit. Go ahead and pull yours up. Our last presentation of the day before we move to discussions. Do you want? Sarit needs no introduction. Your final presentation of the day is the ArchivesSpace Integration Subteam Activities Report. Your presenter from the team is Sarit Han from the AP Corporate Archives. This session will highlight the ongoing work of the integration subteam and especially their ArchivesSpace integration survey, which you probably saw come across the listservs today or last night. The intended purpose of this survey is to gather updated and new information about known and available integrations with ArchivesSpace and provide a centralized listing, which will include the intended purposes, links to resources, and other information when available. The integration team plans to launch this survey annually or biannually, but I'll let Sarit talk about it more. Sarit?
Hello, everybody. It's good to see you all. Well, I'm Sarit Han, digital archivist for the Corporate Archives, and today I'm also wearing a different hat, and that is a member of the TAC team and integration sub-team. This is actually my last year, so it's going to be kind of interesting what happens next year when I don't have this to do anymore. I'll find something. So this year I found myself leading this group actually mid last year, and so, but I'm very proud of what we have done to date and looking forward to this coming year, and I hope you will all take part. Show of hands, anybody here use ArchivesSpace? You never know. And then my other question for you, does anybody use another system that they integrate or need or work with ArchivesSpace in some capacity? Okay. So the majority of us do some kind of integration or plugin, whatever. So just to let you know what our group does, because you may be like, what do you do? The actual development, the actual integration, tell us how to do it. Well, no. So we maintain the public pages for integrations, which provides resources. We assemble those resources, and we're getting into the surveying business. A couple of years ago, several years ago, the pandemic's fuzzy in my brain with the timetable, there was another survey, I think just before I joined TAC. But the results were put up on the main page, and it was this big table, and it was a lot of work put into it, and I applaud everyone who's done it. And now the goal was to improve upon that and make it more readable, but we needed more information. What we don't do is we don't do development. We don't make recommendations. It's up to you what you want to use. And we don't do any kind of testing. Why am I telling you that? For those of you who are resisting applying to be a TAC member, you don't need to be technically inclined to be on TAC. I know this. So my little plug-in for join up. All right. So anybody here ever visit Confluence pages? Great, so you're familiar. So these are the integration pages on the ArchivesSpace public site. And we have updated them so they're a little bit more user-friendly. And as you can see here, that's a table of contents to the child pages for integrations. And you can get to them through the navigation pane right there. So each of these pages have different types of information, methods, types, and why integrate. And the big part that we've been working on is the integration scenarios. We've created these categories, which were there, but with the help of Christine, we made sure that they were more in line and systematic throughout or universal throughout the whole place. We also created new pages where we broke them, all the integrations we know about, into these categories. And each of these pages has the description of what the category is. We put the data into those new tables, and we'll talk about it in a minute. And this is the other page that talks about how to propose integrations. This was pre-existing, so, and will be under review to make sure that if there's anything that needs to be updated. And this is the kind of work that we are doing. This morning, the announcement went out that we have a new survey. It's very different from the last one. It might seem a little bit longer, but we've tried to improve upon it. It will be running from today to the end of November. At this moment, it'll either be annually or biannually. We're still determining that. It is dependent upon your input for its success and for the information to be available to the wider community. The more of you who respond, the more information we have. Now, one of the things we wanted to do was make sure that this was very inclusive. So users, administrators, and developers, the whole survey is designed that everybody should be able to answer. The lists on the page are not exhaustive, but that's because we're not going out and developing integrations. These are the lists where you can find the link to the survey, or you can just contact me and I'll be happy to give it to you. All right, I just wanted to give you a little look at the new survey. When you come to the survey, it will have this introduction here, just to give you some little bit of information. We have accessible links that will take you to the public pages if you have any questions. And I also have a note there, or we put in a note, that you will want to gather some information before completing the survey. So make sure you take a look at that to prepare for this survey. And to give you an idea of what it looks like, it collects your demographics, it has drop-down lists. You don't have to type in all this information. We just wanted to standardize this so that it was easy, plug and play. And you will go through a couple of questions on whether or not you even use ArchivesSpace, because who knows? We provide you with a list of ones we already know and ask you if you have any further information. Then you have the option to report a different integration that we may not know about, and to tell us who you are, any resources available, and then we ask you some information, but we provide you with the drop-down. So you don't have to create your whole new thing. You don't have to imagine it on your own. And these are the categories, and that way, when everything comes to us, it's easy plug and play to update the pages. So, back to the pages. What we will do with the survey data. This is a new table we created, and the data will go in here. Sorry, the mask is just making it hard to, it's a heavy mask. So the purpose behind this table, the redesigning of this table, was that we wanted it to be much more focused on the system itself, not the reporter so much. Because everybody uses each system differently or with some modification. So what we did is this top part is about the program, the system that's integrated. And down here, in the middle section there, is it with the resource information, links to the resources. So if it changes, it gets updated, there's additional ones, we can just plug it in. But it's down here, we have the implementer information. Basic. If you want to give us contact, I know this is public already, so thank you, Joshua, for your name. Somebody else, like you may be interested in OnBase, let me contact Joshua. He may not have developed it, which he did, but he might be able to help you figure out what you want, what you don't want, how they do it, how they don't do it. But at least we're trying to make this part a little bit less prescriptive, just generic data about the system, and you can find out how different people use it, because everyone uses it differently. So we don't anticipate the data being ready until after the new year, since we'll be closing November 30th, and then the holidays. Everybody goes on break, most of us. I do want, though, you to know that we have a nice group. Myself, I'm the lead this year. Elizabeth Dunham, who is the vice lead. Austin Munsell and Paige Munlux. And together, we are working on making sure that this is all available for you, for those who have questions on any kind of system that integrates with ArchivesSpace. Thank you. After this, please fill out the survey.